The candles had been lit by someone who understood restraint. 4 in the bedchamber, no more. 2 on the mantelpiece, 1 on the dressing table, 1 beside the bed where the coverlet had been turned down with geometric precision. The room smelled of beeswax and lavender, and through the tall windows, the last gray light of a March evening pressed against the glass like a hand laid flat. Imogen Fawcett, Imogen Ashby now, though the name sat on her like a coat she had not yet been measured for, stood at the center of the room and understood the silence for what it was. Not peace, instruction. The room had been arranged to tell her something, that she was expected, that she was temporary, that the house had been here before her and would be here after. She touched nothing. She waited. Callum Ashby, 5th Duke of Renwick, entered the bedchamber 14 minutes after her. She knew because she had counted the ticks of the mantel clock, not from anxiety, but from the habit of a woman who had spent her life in rooms where she was expected to be still and had learned to fill the stillness with measurement. He closed the door behind him with the care of a man who did not wish to suggest intimacy by forgetting to. He did not come to her. He went to the window, drew the curtain half an inch, looked at nothing, and let it fall. "I should be direct with you," he said. His voice was not unkind. That was the worst of it. Had it been cruel, she could have armored against it. Instead, it was the voice of a man settling an account. "This marriage was compelled by the terms of my father's will. I was required to marry within 6 months of his death or forfeit the estate to a cousin I have never met and whose only qualification is a shared surname. You were suitable." He paused. She did not fill it. "You will share my bed tonight because the law requires consummation, and I will not have the marriage challenged on those grounds. But you will not share my name. Not in any way that matters. You will not be introduced at court. You will not sit beside me at dinner. You will not act as mistress of this house. You are here to satisfy a clause, and when that clause is satisfied, we will live separately under the same roof and trouble each other as little as possible." The clock on the mantel ticked. A log shifted in the grate with a sound like a bone cracking. Imogen looked at him. Not with hurt. He had braced for hurt. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the way his weight had shifted to his back foot as though preparing to absorb an impact. Not with anger. Not with the tears that he had almost certainly rehearsed responses to. She looked at him the way a surveyor looks at a property whose dimensions have been mismeasured on the deed. "Very well," she said, 2 words, delivered with the same intonation one might use to accept a second cup of tea. She saw something move behind his eyes. Not guilt, not yet, but the faintest disturbance of a man who had expected resistance and received instead something he could not push against. He came to her then, because the terms required it, and she received him with the same composed stillness with which she had received his words. When it was done, he turned away from her in the bed, and within 20 minutes his breathing had steadied into sleep. Imogen lay still for 1 hour. She listened to the house, the timbers settling, a door somewhere on the ground floor being checked by a footman making his rounds. The particular quality of silence that a large house produces at night, not the absence of sound, but the presence of waiting, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath between one generation and the next. At 1:30 in the morning, she rose. She dressed without light, by touch, her fingers finding the gray wool dress she had traveled in, the buttons she had fastened and unfastened 1,000 times, the boots she could lace with her eyes closed and often had in the cold dark of her father's rectory where candles were rationed past October. She pinned her hair in the style she had worn since she was 17, simple, exact, requiring no mirror and no maid. She opened the bedchamber door and stepped into the corridor. The house at night was a different country. She walked it as she walked all unfamiliar rooms, slowly, one hand trailing the wall, memorizing the distance between doors. The corridor gave onto a staircase. The staircase gave onto a hall. The hall was floored in stone that held the cold like water in a basin, and at the far end, a single candle burned on a side table beside a vase of hothouse flowers that no one would see until morning. She found the kitchens first. A scullery maid asleep on a bench beside the banked fire startled awake and stared at her as though she were an apparition. "I am the Duchess of Renwick," Imogen said. Her voice was quiet and without apology. "What is your name?" The girl, 15, perhaps 16, with flour still in the creases of her knuckles, said her name was Peg. "Peg, when does the cook rise?" 5 o'clock, Your Grace. The title came out automatically, the way a curtsy comes before thought. And breakfast for the household staff? 5:30, Your Grace. Porridge and bread. Thank you, Peg. Go back to sleep. She found the housekeeper's sitting room next, a door marked by the ring of keys hanging from a hook beside it, visible in the thin candlelight from the passage sconce. She knocked twice, firmly, the knock of a woman who understood that hesitant knocking earns hesitant answers. Mrs. Crow opened the door in her nightcap and woolen wrapper, and for 3 full seconds simply looked at the woman standing in her corridor at 1:45 in the morning. She was a woman of perhaps 55, with hands that had managed linen closets for 3 decades, and eyes that had survived 2 dukes and a dowager. Your Grace, she said, not a question. Mrs. Crow, I apologize for the hour. I would like to understand the house. Something moved across the housekeeper's face. Not surprise exactly, but the expression of a woman who has been waiting for competence the way a dry field waits for rain. She stepped back from the door and reached for her candle. They walked the house together for 3 hours. Imogen asked questions that Mrs. Crow had not been asked in the 11 months since the old Duke's death. How many rooms were shut up and why? Which chimneys drew poorly? Where the damp had come in along the east corridor and whether the roof had been inspected? How many servants remained on full wages and how many had been reduced? What the tenants' rents were and when they fell due? Whether the still room was stocked for spring, whether the linen had been inventoried since the funeral. Mrs. Crow answered every question, and with each answer, Imogen asked a better one, not the questions of a woman playing at authority, but the questions of a woman who had run a household on less than nothing and understood that competence begins with inventory. By 4 o'clock, they had covered the ground floor, the first floor, the still room, the wine cellar, and the servants' hall. Imogen had learned the name of every servant who slept in the house, 14 in total, reduced from 22 under the previous Duke. She had identified 3 immediate problems: a leak in the larder ceiling that was threatening the stores, a coal delivery that was 3 weeks overdue, and a footman named Alderton whose wages had not been paid since January, because no one had the authority to approve the household accounts. I will approve them, Imogen said, standing in the housekeeper's sitting room as the first gray light began to press against the windows. This morning. Have them brought to the breakfast room. Mrs. Crow looked at her with an expression that Imogen would not fully understand until years later, the look of a woman who has been holding a house together with her fingernails and has just been told she can let go. Yes, Your Grace. One more thing, Mrs. Crow. The Duke takes his breakfast at what hour? 9 o'clock, Your Grace, in the morning room. I will take mine at 8, in the breakfast room. Is there a difference? The breakfast room is larger, Your Grace, south-facing. It has not been used since her late Grace passed. Then air it. When Imogen returned to the corridor outside the ducal bedchamber at 4:30, she paused. Through the door, she could hear Callum's breathing, still deep, still steady, the sleep of a man who believed he had settled everything. She did not go in. She walked instead to the room that had been prepared for her own use, a smaller chamber 3 doors down, with a narrow bed and a writing desk and a window that faced the garden, and she sat at the desk and began to write. She wrote a letter to the coal merchant in the village, inquiring after the overdue delivery. She wrote a second to the estate's solicitor, not Mr. Baird, who served the Duke's personal interests, but the firm in Ipswich that handled the tenants' leases, requesting copies of all current agreements. She wrote a third to her sister Constance, 3 lines only. I am well. The house needs work. I am glad of it. She signed each letter with her full name. Imogen Ashby, Duchess of Renwick. Callum came down at 9. He entered the morning room, where he had taken breakfast alone for 11 months, and found it empty. No place laid, no coffee, no fire in the grate. He stood for a moment in the doorway, processing the absence the way one processes a word in a familiar sentence that has been replaced with a different word. The meaning almost holds, but something has shifted. He pulled the bell. A footman appeared, Alderton, whose wages Imogen had approved 90 minutes earlier. Where is breakfast? In the breakfast room, Your Grace. Her Grace instructed it moved this morning. Her Grace. He heard it the way you hear a note struck on an instrument you thought was out of tune. Not wrong exactly, but unexpected. He walked to the breakfast room and found it transformed, the south-facing windows letting in the thin March sun, the table laid for one, a fire burning in the grate, and Imogen seated at the far end with the household accounts open beside her plate and a cup of tea growing cold at her elbow. She looked up when he entered. She did not stand. She did not smile. She did not perform anything. No warmth, no defiance, no challenge. She simply looked at him as though his arrival in a room where she was working was a minor interruption she was prepared to accommodate. "Good morning," she said. "There is coffee on the sideboard. Mrs. Crow tells me you take it black." He poured his coffee. He sat down across from her. He watched her turn a page of the accounts with the same unhurried precision with which she did everything. And he understood, not fully, not yet, but in the way that a man understands he is miscounted when the figures will not balance, that something had happened while he slept. He did not say it then. The understanding came in stages, the way light comes in winter, not all at once, but by degrees, so gradual that you cannot say exactly when the room stopped being dark. It came when Pelling, the steward, appeared after breakfast to report on a boundary dispute with the neighboring estate, and addressed his first remark to Imogen, not Callum. Not from disrespect, from the practical recognition that she had asked about the boundary the previous evening, and he was answering her question. It came when Mrs. Crow brought the week's menus for approval and brought them to the breakfast room, where Imogen had established herself, rather than to the study, where Callum sat among his late father's papers and felt increasingly like a guest in a house that was legally his. It came when the coal was delivered. Imogen's letter had caught the Morning Post, and the merchant's boy asked for the Duchess by name because her letter had been the first clear instruction he had received from the estate in nearly a year. It came most clearly on the fourth day, when Callum entered the drawing room at 3:30 to find Imogen conducting an interview with a young woman from the village who had applied for a position as second housemaid. Imogen was asking her about her previous work with the quiet thoroughness of a woman who had hired and managed staff before, which, Callum realized with a sensation like stepping onto a stair that was not there, she almost certainly had. He knew almost nothing about her. He had chosen her specifically because he did not wish to know. He stood in the doorway and watched his wife run his house, and for the first time he felt the precise shape of what he had done on their wedding night. He had told her she could not use his name. She had taken it, not by argument, not by tears, not by the performance of wounded dignity that he had prepared himself to dismiss. She had taken it by being the only person in the house who knew how to carry it. The Dowager arrived on the 6th day. Lady Renwick had not attended the wedding, a pointed absence that had said more than any presence could, and her arrival at Renwick Park was announced by the sound of carriage wheels on gravel and the particular quality of silence that descends on a household when its most formidable member approaches. Callum met his mother in the entrance hall. She looked older than when he had last seen her, at the funeral, but her eyes were the same, observant, calculating, and entirely without sentiment. "You married quickly," she said. "The will required it." The will required a wife. It did not require haste. Her gaze moved past him to the hall itself, the flowers on the side table, the polished floor, the faint smell of beeswax and lavender that had replaced the musty neglect of the previous months. "Who is managing the house?" "Imogen." His mother's eyebrow rose 1/4 of an inch. "Your wife?" "Yes." "The rector's daughter from Suffolk?" "Yes." Lady Renwick said nothing further. She allowed herself to be shown to her rooms by Mrs. Crow, who walked beside her with the measured deference of a woman who understood that this visit was not social. It was an inspection. Imogen met the Dowager at dinner. She had dressed carefully, not elaborately, but with the precision that Callum was beginning to recognize as her native language. A cream muslin evening dress, high-waisted, the only ornament a small garnet cross at her throat that had belonged to her mother. She wore it the way she wore everything, as though the clothes had been designed around her stillness rather than the other way round. Lady Renwick studied her across 3 courses with the frank assessment of a woman who had spent 40 years reading people at dinner tables. Imogen neither wilted under the scrutiny nor performed against it. She ate. She answered questions about the house, about the tenants, about the coal delivery and the leaking larder and Alderton's unpaid wages, with the same calm thoroughness she brought to everything. After dinner, when Imogen had withdrawn and Callum sat alone with his port, his mother remained in the drawing-room doorway and said without turning, She is not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone who would tolerate it. She looked at him then. She is not tolerating it, Callum. She is replacing you. He did not answer. He sat with the port untouched and listened to the house, to Imogen's footsteps ascending the staircase, to Mrs. Crow's voice in the servants' hall giving the morning instructions, to the particular quality of order that had settled over Renwick Park like snowfall, quiet and total and impossible to reverse. And he understood that his mother was not wrong. In the weeks that followed, Callum discovered what it felt like to be unnecessary in one's own house. It was not dramatic. There was no confrontation, no locked door, no scene. It was the accumulation of small moments in which his presence was politely acknowledged and his absence was not noticed. He came down one morning to find the entrance hall rearranged. The heavy mahogany table his father had placed there 30 years ago had been moved to the gallery, and in its place stood a lighter piece, a satinwood console that had been in storage since his mother's time, with fresh flowers and a silver tray for calling cards. He had not been consulted. He had not been informed. The change was simply there, as though the house had decided it for itself. He went to the study to write a letter and found the ink dry in the well. It had been 3 weeks since anyone had refilled it, because no one came to the study anymore. Pelling brought the estate papers to the breakfast room now, where Imogen worked, and the post was delivered there too. The study, which had been his father's seat of power and which Callum had inherited like a throne he did not want, had quietly become a room that the house moved around rather than through. One afternoon, he walked into the servants' hall to speak to Mrs. Crow about a matter he could no longer remember afterwards, and found Imogen there instead, seated at the long table with the cook and the head gardener, reviewing the provisions order for the month. They looked up when he entered, all three of them, with the polite, slightly puzzled expression of people who have been interrupted by someone who does not usually come to this part of the house. Imogen said, "Did you need something?" And he said, "No," and left and stood in the corridor outside for a full minute with his hand on the wall, breathing. It was not cruelty. That was what made it so effective. Cruelty he could have resisted, argued against, used as evidence that she was the one at fault. This was competence, administered without malice, and it left him with nothing to push against except the growing awareness that the house he had been born in now ran better without him than it ever had with him. The public moment came 5 weeks after the wedding. It was not a ball, not a dinner, not any of the occasions that Callum might have prepared himself for. It was the quarter sessions in the village, a routine matter, the local magistrate hearing disputes about hedgerows and drainage, at which the Duke's attendance was customary but not required. Callum had not intended to bring Imogen. He had not intended to bring her anywhere, but she was already in the carriage when he came down the front steps, seated, gloved, her bonnet tied beneath her chin with the same unhurried precision, a leather folio of estate papers on the seat beside her. "The Marshfield tenants have a drainage petition," she said. "Mr. Pelling and I reviewed it yesterday. The eastern ditch has silted up since November, and it is affecting 3 farms. He stood on the gravel and looked at her. She looked back at him with the steady, unself-conscious composure that he had come to understand was not performance. It was architecture. She was built this way, still at the center, precise at the edges, entirely without the need for his approval or his resistance or anything from him at all. He got into the carriage. At the quarter sessions, in the low-ceilinged room above the village inn where the magistrate kept his bench, Callum watched Imogen present the drainage petition with the clarity and preparation of a woman who had read every document, walked every boundary, spoken to every affected tenant. The magistrate, who had known the late Duke, who had watched the estate stumble through 11 months of neglect, listened with the expression of a man who has just been shown the location of a door he has been looking for. When the petition was heard and the order granted, the magistrate turned to Callum and said, "Your Grace, please extend our compliments to the Duchess. The tenants will be grateful." And Callum heard it. Your Grace, the Duchess. His name, his title, his house, his tenants, his land, spoken in her direction by a man who had known his family for 30 years. She had not asked for it. She had not demanded it. She had simply done the work until the name attached itself to her like a shadow to its source. That evening, at dinner, he spoke to her directly for the first time since the wedding night. Not about the house, not about the accounts, not about coal or drainage or Alderton's wages. "I owe you an apology," he said. She set down her fork. She looked at him across the length of the table, the same table where his mother had studied her, where Mrs. Crow had served her, where she had eaten alone every morning for 5 weeks while he hid in his study and pretended the house was still his. "For which part?" she said. "He deserved that. He knew he deserved it the way you know a debt is owed, not from the ledger but from the weight of it. For the terms I set, on our wedding night, they were not the terms of a man who understood what he had." She was quiet for a moment. The candles on the table burned without flickering, the air in the room so still it felt held. "You did not know what you had," she said. "That is not a crime. It is an oversight. And if I know now, then you will have to earn the right to say so." He looked at her. This woman he had chosen because she was quiet, because she was suitable, because she would not complicate anything, and understood at last that he had married the most complicated person he had ever met. Her complexity was simply not where he had looked for it. It was not in her voice or her manner or her demands. It was in the architecture of her silence, the 1,000 small, precise acts that had rebuilt his house, his name, his tenants' trust, while he sat in a study and mourned a freedom he had never actually possessed. He earned it slowly, not through grand gestures. Imogen did not trust grand gestures, having spent her life around men who substituted them for substance. He earned it through the quality she valued most: presence. The first morning he came to the breakfast room instead of the morning room, Imogen looked up from the household ledger and said nothing. She did not remark on it. She did not welcome him. She simply continued her work, and he sat across from her and ate his eggs in a room that smelled of spring light and beeswax and the particular quiet industry of a woman who had been awake for 3 hours before him. He began attending the morning meetings with Pelling. At first he sat and listened and contributed nothing, a spectator at his own estate's management, but Imogen did not treat him as an intruder. She treated him as a colleague who had arrived late and needed to be brought up to speed. She explained the tenants' leases without condescension. She walked him through the repairs she had commissioned, the larder ceiling, the east corridor damp, the stable roof that had been leaking since September, with the same methodical patience she brought to everything. She did not say, "I did this while you were hiding." She simply showed him the work and let him draw his own conclusions. He read the tenants' letters. There were 47 of them, accumulated over 11 months, unanswered, stuffed into a drawer in the study desk. Imogen had already answered everyone. She had found them in the second week and replied on estate stationery she had ordered herself, signing each letter with her name and title. When Callum read her copies, filed neatly in a ledger, he found them precise, courteous, and entirely competent. The tenants wrote back to her now, not to him. He could not blame them. He took his seat in the House of Lords that spring. It was the first session he had attended since his father's death, and he went because the drainage bill affecting their county's waterways was coming to debate, and Imogen had prepared a summary of how it would affect the estate's tenants. 4 pages, closely written in her small, exact hand, with the relevant clauses annotated and the projected costs calculated against the estate's current accounts. He read it in the carriage on the way to Westminster, and understood with a clarity that felt like shame that she had been governing his lands more capably than he had ever intended to govern them himself. The house was half empty. A Tuesday in April, the benches sparsely occupied, the Lord Chancellor's voice echoing in the vaulted chamber. Callum sat in his father's seat and listened to the debate and thought about Imogen's summary, about the Marshfield ditch and the 3 farms that flooded every winter, about a woman who had walked his darkened corridors in the first hours of her marriage and made herself the answer to every question the house had been asking for a year. When a baron from the neighboring county rose to argue against the bill on grounds of cost, Callum stood, surprising himself more than anyone, and spoke. He cited the drainage figures from Imogen's summary. He described the flooding. He used the tenants' names because she had written them down and he had finally read them. It was a small contribution, 3 minutes, perhaps 4. But it was the first time he had spoken in the house, and when he sat down, he felt something shift, not in the chamber, but in himself, as though a door he had kept locked had been opened from the other side. When he returned to Renwick Park that evening, she was in the garden, the first time he had seen her there, her hands not in the soil but at her sides, walking the paths with Mrs. Crow and discussing which beds should be cleared for spring planting. She wore a pelisse over her gray dress and a bonnet that shaded her face, and when she turned at the sound of his boots on the gravel path, something in her expression shifted, not softened exactly, but opened, the way a window opens when the latch is finally released. "How is the house?" she asked. "The drainage bill passed its second reading." "Good. The Marshfield ditch needs statutory backing or the neighboring estate will block the outflow again next winter." He stood on the path and looked at her and said, "I should like to introduce you, at court, properly." She studied him, the same surveyor's gaze she had turned on him the first night, measuring, assessing, determining whether the dimensions matched the deed. "Why?" she said. "Because you are the Duchess of Renwick, and everyone who matters already knows it except the people I have kept it from." The presentation at court was in June. Imogen wore ivory silk and the Renwick pearls, 3 strands that had been locked in the estate safe since the previous Duchess's death, and that Mrs. Crowe had cleaned and restrung herself, because Imogen had not asked for them, and Callum had brought them to her room and laid them on the dressing table without a word, and she had understood the gesture for what it was, not a gift, a recognition. The Queen received her. Callum stood beside her and said her name, her full name, his name, the name he had told her she could not have, and said it clearly, said it so that everyone in the drawing room heard it and did not look away from her face while he said it. Imogen curtsied. She rose. She looked at him, and for the first time in their marriage, she smiled, not broadly, not warmly, but with the precise, contained expression of a woman who has been acknowledged and finds the acknowledgment sufficient. That was the moment Lady Renwick, watching from the gallery, turned to Mrs. Crowe, who had accompanied the household to London, and said, "He is lost entirely, and he does not even mind." Mrs. Crowe, who had watched Imogen walk the darkened corridors of Renwick Park at 2 in the morning and claim a house that did not want to be claimed, said, "No, my lady, he is not lost. He has simply stopped playing the wrong game." The will was never mentioned again. Mr. Baird came once in September to confirm that the marriage condition had been satisfied and the estate was secured, and Callum signed the necessary papers in the study while Imogen was in the still room with Mrs. Crowe, inventorying the autumn preserves. He did not tell her when it was done. She did not ask. The will had ceased to be the reason for anything long before the ink was dry. Their son was born the following spring, a healthy boy with his mother's dark hair and his father's gray eyes, and Imogen named him herself, not after the late Duke, not after Callum's family. She chose the name Thomas because it had belonged to no one in either family, because it carried no expectation and no debt, because she wanted her son to begin with a name that was entirely his own. Callum did not argue. He had learned, slowly, precisely, the way Imogen taught everything, that the woman he had married did not make arbitrary choices. Every decision had architecture, every silence had a floor plan. Years later, Thomas was 4, chasing the stable cat across the kitchen garden while Pelling pretended not to watch from the study window. Callum found Imogen in the breakfast room, the south-facing room. Their room now, though he still thought of it as hers, the way you think of a country that existed before you arrived in it. She was reading a letter from Constance, her sister, and the morning light caught her face in a way that stopped him in the doorway. Not because she was beautiful, though she was, because she was present, entirely, architecturally, immovably present, in a house she had claimed in the dark and never relinquished. Thomas ran in from the garden with the cat under one arm and mud on both knees, and said with the frank curiosity of a child who notices everything and understands nothing, "Papa, why do you always look at Mama like that?" Callum looked at his wife. She looked back at him over the top of her sister's letter with one eyebrow raised, the same expression she had given him across 100 breakfast tables, 1,000 quiet mornings, an entire marriage built not on the terms he had set, but on the terms she had replaced them with. "Because," he said, "I lost an argument on the first night of our marriage, and I have been trying to catch up ever since." Imogen turned a page of the letter. "You're not catching up," she said. "I know." "Good," she said. And there it was. That word again, the same word she had used on their wedding night when he had delivered his terms and she had received them with 2 syllables and then dismantled them in the dark. Good. As though the entire history of their marriage, his coldness, her competence, his slow and humbling recognition that he had married someone whose architecture was deeper than anything he had ever built, could be contained in a single word, spoken without emphasis, over a cooling cup of tea. The letter from his father's solicitor, The one confirming the will's terms, the one Mr. Baird had filed and Callum had signed, sat in the bottom drawer of the study desk, where no one opened it and no one needed to. Above it, in the top drawer, was the household ledger in Imogen's hand, every quarter balanced, every tenant accounted for, every penny of the estate's income and expenditure recorded in the small, precise script of a woman who had once been told she would share a bed but not a name, and who had responded by taking both before dawn. They arrive here, like a name finally spoken in full, whenever they are ready.